Thank you so much for the invitation to the Sabanja conference, and I'm very sorry that I could not make it in person. I'm now recording the paper so that people can hear it along with the others on the website. The earliest decade, 1918 to 1928. We've gathered to discuss the early decades of the Republic of Turkey, formally established 100 years ago on 29 October 1923. I contend that the most important period for a truly critical understanding of the making of the Republic is the earliest decade, 1918 to 1928. This might seem odd as it precedes the formal declaration of a republic by 5 years and only allows us to follow the life of the Republic through its first 5 years of nominal existence. By looking at this early decade, we connect the 5 years before the establishment of the Republic with the 5 years after, capturing events, conflicts, and political and social processes which contain, if not subsume, the topics of all the preceding panels we had enjoyed in the 2 days of the conference. It was in that earliest decade that questions of institutions of sovereignty, monarchy or republic, peoples, who is a Turk and who is not, and religion, where do non-Muslims fit, if anywhere, and what relationship do Muslim religious institutions have to political power in the new political schema, were blown apart and ultimately resolved, that the foundations of the Republic were set and political authority consolidated, and likely when the arts were in their most fluid and therefore interesting framework. All of these processes fold in on and can be illuminated through the lens of opposition or Muhalefet. Muhalefet, as a word, is a survivor. It is one of the rare words in Turkey today that has survived the successive rounds of epistemic violence done to the Turkish language. The language reforms, after all, were aimed at excising so many words of Arabic or Persian derivation and generating pure Turkish neologisms in so many instances. We can even say with some comic irony that the continuous usage of the word Muhalefet is itself a subtle form of opposition to the Turkification processes that undergirded and sustained the Republic. Because the word has survived and because of its unique relationship to politics and culture throughout this transition, excavating its changing usages and meanings allows us to see the continuities underneath and beyond several political and social ruptures. The 1908 Constitutional Revolution, the Ottoman defeat and Allied occupation, the rise of the national resistance and then national independence movement, and the formation of the single-party republic. Power, or iktidar, is today understood as the symmetrical opposite of Muhalefet, which is now the ruling party, or the ruling party versus opposition party. And this has been true since the advent of the multi-party era in the late 1940s. My book, Turkey, A Past Against History, demonstrated a much more complex relationship between Muhalefet and political power than one of symmetrical and diametrically opposed entities, because Muhalefet in the course of the 20th century has meant far more than opposition party in Turkish politics and culture. Its usage was relative and contingent on the particular constitution of power across several eras and at least 3 forms of sovereignty. There was Muhalefet, people who identified with it and discourse enacted by it, in the absence of any institutionalized, sustained, and sanctioned opposition party per se between 1908 and the late 1940s. And that history inflected its meanings in the multi-party era and beyond. In the book, I trace the history, itinerary, if you will, and discursive space of Muhalefet across the institutional divide between the Ottoman Sultanate and the Republic of Turkey, and contend that that history is buried under the surface of politics in Turkey even today, informing the connotations of the word Muhalefet and the culture of political opposition. Under the surface as it is, the word and concept of Muhalefet has a particular array of meanings that are both unique to Turkey and often taken for granted by native speakers of Turkish. This is not to say that Muhalefet, or opposition, has never been studied, far from it. Turkish historians such as Cemil Koçak have studied many forms of Muhalefet in the Republican period, although they have not problematized it and its complicated journey through the process of transition, or we might say transmutation from Ottoman to Republican Turkish sovereignty, as I do in my book. The longer history of Muhalefet and its significance across the breach between Ottoman and Republican Turkish forms of sovereignty in this earliest decade has remained half hidden, even as the use of the word was and is ubiquitous. As I argue in my book, Muhalefet, its changing usages and its history, is a cipher for understanding the broader space of politics and the relationship between literature, culture, and politics in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries across the divide between the Ottoman Sultanate and the Republic of Turkey. For this reason, the earliest decade of the Republic does not begin with its formal proclamation in October 1923, but with the end of World War I in October-November of 1918, and extends through Mustafa Kemal's Nutuk, or Great Speech, given in October 1927, for reasons I will elaborate below. Prelude. The prelude to this story of Muhalefet lies in the mid-19th century Tanzimat reforms and movements for liberal constitutionalist reform, which crested in the 1860s and early 1870s. There, Muhalefet was discussed as a positive value, a virtue, and a necessary component in a hypothetical pluralist constitutional order. Here we might translate Muhalefet as opposition in the sense of loyal opposition, and concomitant with this was the idea that dissent and political pluralism were a constituent feature of a legitimate constitutional order. Although, as we see from the fate of Namık Kemal, multiple rounds of exile from the 1860s until his death in 1888, and Mithat Pasha, exile and ultimately execution, the two biggest heroes of constitutionalist thought and action in the Tanzimat era, enacting Muhalefet was a doomed proposition, even in the liberal 1860s, and definitely upon Abdülhamid II's accession to the throne in late 1876. This is not news. Out of the conditions of the Hamidian era, which I do not have to outline for this audience, there emerged multiple constitutional tendencies in opposition to the despotism of Abdülhamid II, especially from the 1880s. This was not simply, as we're often left to believe, the same constitutional movement going into a slumber as young Ottomans and emerging as young Turks. Instead, and this is important for the 20th century path that Muhalefet would take, there was a generational, socioeconomic, and ideological break between the young Ottomans and young Turks, or many breaks as multiple factions developed in secrecy and in exile. Some men continued on a young Ottoman liberal or decentralist trajectory, Prince Sabahattin's and many other tendencies, and others, namely the Committee for Union and Progress, which came to embody the centralist faction. This is not news either. The CUP, a secret society that would later become an organization and then a political party, was part of the broader Young Turk constitutionalist movement that took shape abroad and in the military, and would come to play a pivotal role in the next 2 decades at least. Today, they're seen in popular Turkish imagination as heroic opponents who fought for constitutionalism against the despotism of Sultan Abdülhamid II. In actuality, the language of opposition was not there from the start. We noticed between 1902 and 1908 a shift in language from a terminology that included patriotic, vatansever, vatanperest, and liberal, hürriyetperver, to describe their movement and their first 1902 Congress in Paris, to muhalifin, derived from Muhalefet, only in December of 1907, the second Congress of the Opposition, Muhalifin Kongresi, and this is a fascinating example of how this history continues to be obfuscated, often unconsciously in Turkey today. Historians call these the first and second Congresses of the Opposition, when in actuality, only the second one used the terminology of opposition, muhalifin. This is news. On the eve of the 1908 constitutional revolution, then, the meaning of Muhalefet crystallized into a specific coalition of 3 broad constitutionalist tendencies, represented by Ahmed Reza, Sabahattin Bey, and Khachadur Malumian, in opposition to the despotism, istibdad, of Abdülhamid. Well, today, the claimants to this identity of muhalifs in popular memory are the CUP, at least by modern historians. If we note Şükrü Hanyolu's book, Young Turks in Opposition, to refer to this pre-1908 period, But as I show, the story becomes much more complicated after the constitutional revolution. The meaning of muhalefet and of power, or iktidar, would change upon the very achievement of the Young Turk movement's goals, the restoration of the Ottoman constitution in July 1908. In this second constitutional period, the words muhalefet and muhalif took on a specific meaning, or series of meanings, a move of special importance to the story I'm relating today. Between 1908 and 1913, politics became polarized between the CUP and those in opposition to the CUP, many of whom were also constitutionalists. To reiterate, the CUP was one of three main opposition blocs leading up to July 1908 with the revolution. They then became a kind of de facto iktidar, or ruling party, in the 5-year experiment with constitutionalism that followed. Those who were dubbed muhalifs from that point on were not unionists, but were instead either one, opposition or dissenting journalists, particularly investigative journalists, and two, those individuals and parties that were in opposition to the CUP, but many of whom were also avowedly constitutionalist. This change in usage happened without any pronouncements or formal declarations. Furthermore, we're not talking about a case where the CUP was simply one of many parties in a multi-party democracy. The whole issue here had to do with the CUP's notion of constitutionalism, which amounted to them using the Constitution as an instrument for power and claiming a kind of supra-partisan status, a kind of guardianship over the system, as opposed to their muhalifs, who would not have wanted to assign such a role to the CUP and who wanted the Constitution to be the law of the land above all parties. This was not a simple case of ruling party, iktidar, and opposition party, muhalif. Instead, it was a qualitative, even a fundamental difference in understanding of what constitutionalism would mean. We could have a long discussion about the ineffectiveness and heterogeneous character of this muhalefet in the form of the Freedom and Entente Party and other iterations. They were not effective, but suffice it to say, the Ottoman Empire went into World War I in a situation where the CUP had taken over the government by force and suppressed all opposition as of June 1913. Now we come to the earliest decade of the Republic, 1918 to 1928. As Hegel said, history is not the soil in which happiness grows. The periods of happiness in it are the blank pages of history. The pages of the decade at hand, 1918 to 1928, are anything but blank by that measure. One of the biggest problems for the historian of this decade is to determine which history is to be written of it. Because if we look at everything that was happening, we see not blank pages, but a palimpsest, layers of scribbles on top of each other. Even if we limit our study to Istanbul, we have a dizzying array of histories in formation. Do we tell the story of Armenian survivors of the genocide trying to imagine a future for themselves in Istanbul, Paris, or Armenia, itself in formation and being subsumed into the space of the Russian Civil War and ultimately the Soviet Union? Do we tell the story of Greeks caught up in layers of conflict about their own constitutional makeup and form of sovereignty in the state of Greece, and embroiled in an expansionist adventure in Western Anatolia, not to mention Greek Orthodox Ottoman subjects caught between multiple claimants to sovereignty? Do we tell the story of Arabs, whose liberation from the Ottomans led rapidly to French and British colonial subjugation under the guise of mandates? Do we tell the story that is most familiar in the context of our present discussion, the story forged by Mustafa Kemal in his late 1927 Nutuk, of European and Greek occupation of Anatolia and Istanbul, and the birth, mobilization, and success of the national resistance come independence movement, culminating in the proclamation of the Republic in October 1923? Or can we tell, and what happens if we do tell, the story of the actors that were embroiled in all of these histories and emerged protagonists in none, the muhalifs? At this moment, coming out of World War I, those who called themselves and were called muhalifs were the liberal constitutionalists, who were also monarchists, we have to admit. They seemed in favor of a constitutional monarchy along British lines. These were predominantly Muslim Turks, elite and well-educated, and their number was dwindling to just a handful between the end of the war in late 1918 and the moment when the British stormed the Ottoman ministries and formalized their occupation of the seat of imperial government in Istanbul. As an organized party, they were an incoherent mess filled with political and cultural and religious dinosaurs. What united them was precisely their opposition, their Muhalefet, which meant to the CUP, which becomes very telling as circumstances shift over the coming 5 years. Here's the crux. Coming out of World War I in late 1918, the word Muhalefet was associated with this liberal opposition to the unionist-dominated regime, a regime which had essentially taken over the Ottoman state. With the Ottoman defeat, the unionist regime per se fell, its leadership scattering and some of its rank and file fleeing to Anatolia to regroup and rearm. The Muhalefet, or the liberal opposition, came into power by default as the Ottoman state came under Allied occupation as a defeated power. What is fascinating, and what I argue very revealing, and this is the big news of this paper, is that they continued to be called and to call themselves Muhalifs, even in the moments when a Damat Ferid Pasha cabinet was in place and in the government, and they became nominally the ruling party, or iktidar. That is to say, even though the CUP formally disbanded and its former members renounced any association with that party, it was the CUP that implicitly or unconsciously still held the place of iktidar by default and or by dint of the fact that everyone knew they were the only power and referred to their opponents as such, as if the CUP were still in power. The Muhalifs, too, were still operating under the assumption that they were in the opposition, even though they were formally in power and running the government, or whatever was left of the Ottoman government at that point. The national resistance and then national independence movement took shape between June 1919 and March-April 1920. This ushered in a period when there were two rival claimants to sovereignty: the Ottoman Sultanate under foreign occupation and based in Istanbul, and the presumptive national government based in Ankara. As we know, there was a process of recruitment, mobilization, and of drawing Istanbul-based elites into the national struggle in Anatolia and to the national government in Ankara as of March-April 1920. And there were many instances when individual military and political intellectual figures remained formally in the ranks of the Ottoman state in Istanbul, but were secretly working with and for the nationalists. All of which, combined with the formalization of British occupation in March-April 1920, tipped the balance, and when the parliament moved to Ankara at that time, tipped the balance from Istanbul to Ankara and lent momentum to the national cause. While the group known as Muhalefet or Muhalifs was admittedly dwindling during this time as more and more left for Ankara, and from spring 1920 to the autumn of 1922, as many struggled to choose between what they saw as the lesser of two evils, British or Allied occupation and potentially mandate or colonial status on the one hand, and a reconstituted CUP turned national movement on the other, the terminology remained the same. Muhalifs were those who remained in Istanbul and remained opposed to what they believed was nothing more than a reconstituted CUP, now calling itself the National Independence Movement. We can discuss the accuracy of the belief that the national movement was the CUP in another guise or another iteration, but we would need first to consider that not only the British and the local non-Muslims left in the area, but also these Muslim liberal Muhalifs shared the same belief, namely that the national movement was none other than the CUP in a new guise. Pointing this fact out became a major feature of Muhalefet in this moment. We can see a vivid illustration of the nationalist view of Muhalifs in the following cartoon from June 1921. The caption, "In the Sabah pharmacy." Sabah, meaning morning, was the paper of record for Ali Kemal and the liberal Muhalifs at the time. The cartoon itself is from the satirical newspaper Güler Yüz from 20th of June, 1337, which is 1921. To clarify, this is a cartoon depicting Ali Kemal and Refik Halit, the eponymous kind of members of this Muhalefet faction. And it is a cartoon depicted by the partisans of the national movement. Notice the white blob in the front. It is labeled Muhalefet. The bowl which Ali Kemal is stirring is labeled nankörlük. Various bottles are labeled uydurma, kepazelik, ihaneti vataniye, cehalet, yalan, and dolan. And underneath on the floor is a bowl labeled ekşai maya. Refik Halit is basically, it's all nonsense, lies, deceit mixed together with muhalefet, or opposition or dissent. Refik Halit is saying, usta, or teacher, to Ali Kemal, won't it make the medicine stronger if we add that one there on the second shelf? They're mixing up a concoction of chaos, lies, deception, and muhalefet in opposition to the national movement, which was in full throttle at that moment in Anatolia. These are the same people, Ali Kemal and Refik Halit, along with many others, who had opposed the CUP in the late Ottoman period. Now they are the phantom muhalefet to the phantom or presumptive power emerging in Anatolia. The dynamic is the same, and it has taken on the character of a vendetta. From the muhalif's perspective, in my book, I provide further illustration of this phenomenon, whereby muhalif and muhalefet continued to refer to a particular stance, profile, and to particular people, regardless of who held the formal reins of power, i.e., its meaning was far more complex than that of a simple opposition party in today's parliamentary discourse. I do this by tracing the, albeit short and excised from the literary record after the fact in the Republican era, moment of construction for muhalefet as a broader political and cultural idea, and even as a literary trope in the works of Refik Halit. Again, while no one openly and consciously proclaimed this political dynamic and lexical phenomenon, between late 1919 and late 1922, I observed that Refik Halit penned many, in fact, a critical mass of stories which depict what was becoming an archetypal muhalif, a tragic figure. The examples are taken from chapter 4 of my book, which focuses on this armistice period. The first example is the story Metempsychosis, wherein Refik Halit uses the concept of transmigration of souls to show that he has been a muhalif since the beginning of time. He would have been in the body of someone scolding Adam and Eve for eating the forbidden fruit, criticizing the construction of Noah's Ark, condemned to the Pharaoh's dungeons, and a Girondin condemned to the guillotine before 9 Thermidor. He was then a Janissary enemy of Alemdar Pasha, separated from his body in the martyrdom of Sultan Selim III in 1807-1808, and finally a muhalif in his current body in 1920, opposing the national movement. Muhalefet was taking on the quality of an essential character trait, not simply association with any old opposition party. The second example is The Suicide of a Muhalif, published in January 1921. It is a monologue set in a dingy hotel room in the back streets of Sirkeci, near the train station in Istanbul. The Muhalif, hopeless and driven insane by his plight, bemoans the path that led him here. Quote, who would have guessed that after the armistice, the Muhalefet would again face such a fate, again like an orphaned child, head hung low, stomach empty, eyes full of tears, heartbroken, sneaking into corners and crawling from door to door, end quote. He narrates the last 10 years, culminating in the present moment when, quote, we are stuck in Istanbul, but the arena for the unionists, i.e. nationalists, the two are elided in the mind of this muhalif, is wide open again. Those who are hungry here in Istanbul can fill their stomachs there in Anatolia. The one who here sees the danger can there find peace, and the one who is here without a position can there find employment. Taking out a rifle, he says, the Anatolia path is closed to us, but the road to paradise, you, the rifle, can open for me, end quote. He shoots the gun and misses, an utter failure. The doomed and tragic moral figure of the muhalif, not simply a member of an opposition party. Where did the muhalifs end up with the national victory in late 1922? Let's take this picture below. We see Ali Kemal, Refik Halit, Reza Tevfik, and Damat Ferit Pasha with their heads on stakes. This appeared when the nationalists under Refet Pasha Bele had just taken over Istanbul in October 1922. One of their very first actions in Istanbul was to take over the newspaper office and printing press of the Muhalefet organ Sabah, named above in the cartoon, and to nationalize it. Below, so we see the front page of Peyam Sabah, which was their newspaper, the Muhalif's newspaper, from the 20th of October, 1922. It was the first issue, I believe, after the nationalist takeover of the press. The heads on stakes from right to left, Aydede, meaning Refik Halit, that was the name of his satirical newspaper of that year, Cenab-Idis, Cenab Sabahattin, with a Greek Idis added to his name to connote his sympathy for the Greeks, Philosoph Artini, Reza Tevfik, the philosopher, dubbed Artin to connote his sympathy for the Armenians, the other one, Damat Ferit Pasha, and himself, Kendisi, meaning the man himself, which everyone would know was Ali Kemal. Ali Kemal would be lynched on the way to court-martial shortly after this date. The others would be exiled and banished from the Turkish nation for a few decades. Why is all this important? The story of Muhalefet and of Muhalifs, which precedes the proclamation of the Republic and continues vehemently out in the open and for the first 5 years, out in the open for the first 5 years and then under the surface thereafter, complicates and indeed undermines the most basic claims of the Republic, that this state was created ex nihilo, unrelated to all that came before. This is a storyline which shows anything but rupture. It shows a deep political and cultural continuity, and it shows that the vendettas that had taken shape in the late Ottoman Empire were being played out well into the Republican era. Not just the vendettas against non-Turks, i.e. Greeks and Armenians, but within the category of Turk and along partisan lines. This is not to say there were no levels of rupture. Indeed, as a form of sovereignty, the choice of republic was as radical as it was logical in the moment. Months after the formation of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and in contradistinction to the Greek tangled mess between republic and monarchy with which the Turkish nationalists were at war. But from this story, we can see the ways that the partisan conflict was embedded in the national struggle, and the narrative that was constructed ex post facto, beginning in its most hegemonic form with Nutuk, buried that fact, marginalizing these muhalifs as simply traitors to the nation, hain, and claiming the entire space of the nation for the Republican People's Party. What did these muhalifs stand for? In their own telling, they stood for an albeit elitist kind of liberal constitutionalism, probably one which would have kept the Sultanate and perhaps Caliphate together in name. They stood for a gradualist solution along the lines of British constitutional monarchy. And sure, there were so many reasons why this was an impossibility at that moment. I do not want to make heroes out of these men or claim that things would have been better had they won the day. They were never in a position to win the day, so that is an impossibility. But we cannot fully understand the leadership of the national movement, of the Republican People's Party, or of the Republic if we do not understand the sorting, even editing process, literally in many cases, that took place in this earliest decade. The boundaries of the nation were in flux, even within the category of Turk, and politics were driving the determination of those boundaries. In the narrative forged by their enemies, the nationalists, those who went on to proclaim a republic 100 years ago, they were monarchists, compromised and sold out to the allies who had won the war. They were traitors to the emergent Turkish nation, and their persistence should be to us a signal that the Turkish nation was a partisan entity with a particular leadership and a particular partisan agenda. This was not the only state to be formed along partisan lines, projecting a national unity to garner international legitimacy and the allegiances of the masses. Some such states are still in existence today. But it is remarkable the extent to which this history was buried, these texts excised from the literary record in the Republican era, and these voices were silenced. Further evidence that this was the case is the list of 150, an addendum to the Treaty of Lausanne that was finalized in spring 1924 as the Turkish constitution was being worked out in the Republic. Ali Kemal was not on the list of 150 because he was already dead. Refi Khalid Karay, Refi Cevat Ulunay, Rıza Tevfik Bölükbaşı, and several other journalists and intellectuals were on the list, along with other categories of opponents, such as Cherkez Ethem and other Circassian militia leaders, members of the armistice-era government, etc. And the composition of this list was not a foregone conclusion, but was negotiated over the course of several months after the proclamation of the Republic. In my book, I go on to follow several different trajectories of Muhalefet in the Republic, but for now I will end with the point that the conflicts that were going on between 1918 and 1928 were not resolved. Instead, they were deleted from the official historical narrative and recast to insist on national unity rather than a pluralist vision for a republic. And Turkey is still living with the consequences and the conflicts that were sown in that earliest decade. Thank you.